There is a particular quality to the pain that has marked your most significant years, the kind that does not resolve cleanly, that leaves something changed in its wake, that you have carried in ways you could not always explain to others or even to yourself. Most frameworks for understanding this pain offer one of two inadequate responses. Either treat it as a wound that needs to be healed and moved past, or treat it as evidence of some fundamental inadequacy in yourself. From a Jungian perspective, both of these responses miss what is most important. The pain you have endured was not arbitrary. It was doing something specific in the interior, something that in its own way has been preparing you for exactly what is coming next. What Jung's framework says about pain, and what distinguishes it from most contemporary approaches to suffering, is that it refuses to treat pain as an obstacle to life that must be eliminated as quickly as possible in order for real living to resume. In Jung's understanding, the psyche is purposive. It moves in directions. The suffering it produces is not random noise, but a form of communication from the deeper layers of the psyche to the conscious personality, about what needs to change, what needs to be integrated, what the current configuration of consciousness is excluding. To treat pain as something to be managed away is to miss the signal. And missing the signal does not end the communication. It simply ensures that what is attempting to communicate will find a more insistent way to do so. Jung's engagement with alchemy, particularly in psychology and alchemy, was not antiquarian curiosity. He recognized in the alchemical process a symbolic map of genuine psychological transformation. The first stage, which the alchemists called the nigredo, was characterized by darkness, dissolution, and the breakdown of existing form. The alchemists understood this was not failure. It was the necessary precondition of everything that followed. Nothing could be transmuted that had not first been broken down to its essential substance. Applying this to psychological suffering, the periods of darkness and dissolution, the sense that the existing structure of the self is no longer capable of holding what life requires, these are not evidence of something going wrong. They are the nigredo, and the nigredo always precedes the albedo. The phrase, "about to transform," is not optimism. It is not consolation offered to someone in pain to make the pain feel more bearable. It is a description of something structural, something that happens in the psyche when suffering has reached a particular threshold and has been carried in a particular way. In Jung's framework, the concept of enantiodromia, the tendency of any extreme condition to move toward its opposite, suggests that the psyche has a built-in tendency toward transformation at the edge of endurance. The more fully a painful experience has been inhabited rather than suppressed, the more completely the energy concentrated in that experience becomes available for conversion into something else. The transformation is not guaranteed, but its conditions have already been created by the pain itself. If this is the kind of understanding you have been looking for, the kind that takes the interior life seriously and treats suffering as something that means something rather than something to be simply endured or escaped, subscribe to the channel. This is where that conversation lives. There is a distinction Jung's framework makes, quietly but insistently, between suffering that produces nothing and suffering that produces everything. The difference is not primarily in the intensity or duration of the pain itself. It is in the quality of relationship the individual develops with the suffering while enduring it. Suffering that produces nothing is treated primarily as an enemy, resisted, denied, explained away, or displaced into activity that keeps the interior quiet. Suffering that produces everything is, at some level, genuinely inhabited, felt rather than managed, encountered rather than escaped. The pain that becomes the foundation of real strength is precisely this second kind, and the recognition of what it was doing while it was being endured is the moment at which the transformation begins to become visible. The first thing Jung's framework clarifies about significant psychological pain is what it is doing structurally, not emotionally, not spiritually in a vague sense, but structurally in the actual architecture of the psyche. Whenever a person encounters an experience that exceeds what their current psychological configuration can hold, loss that the existing self-concept cannot metabolize, failure that the identity structure cannot absorb, grief that the defensive organization cannot manage, the existing configuration must, in some form, give way. This giving way is painful. It feels like breaking. But in the Jungian framework, it is precisely the function of significant pain to break what needs to be broken. The structures that have become too rigid, too limiting, or too organized around a version of the self that life is no longer confirming. One of the most consistent functions that serious psychological pain performs, in the framework Jung developed across decades of clinical observation, is its capacity to bring the shadow into unavoidable proximity with consciousness. The shadow, in Jung's understanding, is the sum of everything the ego has refused to acknowledge about itself, the qualities, capacities, fears, and dimensions of experience that were deemed unacceptable by the conscious personality and relegated to the unconscious. Under ordinary conditions, the ego can maintain a comfortable distance from this material. But under the pressure of significant pain, particularly pain that persists beyond the ordinary mechanisms of denial and distraction, the distance collapses. What was shadow becomes visible. And what becomes visible, however uncomfortable, becomes workable for the first time. Jung's concept of the compensatory function of the unconscious is essential to understanding why pain so frequently precedes transformation. The unconscious, in Jung's model, does not simply store what consciousness represses. It actively compensates for the one-sidedness of the conscious personality. When the conscious ego has developed in a direction that is too narrow, too defended, or too organized around a set of values that excludes significant dimensions of the psyche's full range, the unconscious compensates, producing dreams, symptoms, moods, and, in more extreme cases, painful life circumstances that force the conscious personality to encounter what it has been avoiding. The pain in this framework is the compensation become insistent, the psyche's way of making certain that what the ego has excluded can no longer be excluded. Jung's model of psychic energy, which he called libido, using the term in a broader sense than Freud, has direct implications for understanding what pain does to the interior landscape. When significant suffering occupies a substantial portion of the psychic field, it does not simply consume energy, it concentrates it. The pain becomes the site around which psychic energy gathers, creating over time a kind of interior pressure that has nowhere to go except inward. This inward movement is precisely what the individuation process requires. The psychic energy that is concentrated by pain when it is not discharged through denial or compulsive activity becomes available for the interior work of integration, the work of encountering, acknowledging, and eventually assimilating what the pain has been pointing toward. There is a quality of interior experience that accompanies serious psychological pain, a darkening, a contraction, a sense of the ordinary sources of meaning becoming less available and the familiar supports of identity becoming less reliable, that Jung's framework treats not as pathology but as a necessary phase of the psychic process. This darkening is uncomfortable in a way that is difficult to describe to those who have not encountered it directly. It is not simply sadness, not simply depression in the clinical sense, but a quality of having the existing map of the self rendered temporarily illegible. The landmarks that once oriented are no longer sufficient. What this darkening is doing structurally is dismantling the framework that needs to be dismantled in order for a more adequate framework to be built. The illegibility is not the end of meaning, it is the clearing of space for it. if what is being described here corresponds to something you have already lived, a period of pain that in retrospect you can recognize as having done something to you. Write in the comments, "My pain is becoming my strength." That recognition is not small. I read every one. There is a category of knowledge that cannot be acquired by any means other than the specific experience of significant pain. And this is not a romantic assertion, but a precise description of how the psyche develops. The dimensions of psychological depth that emerge through genuine suffering, the capacity for compassion that is not sentimental, the quality of understanding that is not intellectual only, the tolerance for ambiguity and darkness that allows genuine encounter with the complexity of human experience, cannot be cultivated through study, through positive experience, or through any form of deliberate self-improvement practiced from a place of comfort. They are produced specifically by the encounter with what is most difficult. Jung's observation that the most genuinely helpful therapists were those who had been most genuinely wounded reflects this understanding. The wound that becomes the gift cannot be substituted for. In Jung's framework, the individuation process, the lifelong movement toward the fullest expression of the self's unique nature, rarely proceeds primarily through peak experience or conscious intention. It proceeds most powerfully through encounter with what is most challenging. The experiences that force the ego's existing organization to give way, that demand a quality of interior response for which the current configuration is not adequate, are precisely the experiences through which the deeper layers of the psyche become accessible to consciousness. Pain is not the only instrument of individuation, but it is among its most reliable ones. The self that emerges on the other side of serious suffering is not simply the previous self with a difficulty added. It is a self that has been reorganized at a level that voluntary effort rarely reaches. Jung's concept of the wounded healer, drawn from the mythological figure of Chiron, who could heal others precisely because he himself carried an unhealable wound, addresses something specific about the relationship between pain endured and capacity developed. The wound does not produce the gift despite the suffering it carries. It produces the gift because of the suffering it carries. The specific quality of understanding, depth, and relational capacity that makes genuine accompaniment of others possible cannot be grafted on. It must be grown through the particular soil of the individual's own most difficult experience. The wound becomes the access point to exactly the dimension of human experience that the wounded person is, thereafter, most capable of understanding. And that understanding is among the most valuable things a human being can carry into their relationships and their work. What is being built in the interior during the period of significant pain, invisibly below the threshold of what the conscious personality can easily detect, is the psychic capacity that the next phase of the self requires. The ego's existing organization has a ceiling, a limit on what it can hold, integrate, and work with. The pain that exceeds the ceiling does not simply damage what is there. It expands the ceiling. It forces the development of interior structures that were not necessary when the self was operating within more comfortable parameters. The capacity for holding complexity, for tolerating contradiction, for remaining present with difficulty without being destroyed by it, these are developed precisely through the experience of encountering difficulty that was beyond what the previous structure could hold. The expansion is always more than what was lost. The mechanism by which the psyche actually converts suffering into something other than suffering, the process by which the pain endured becomes the strength developed, is described in Jung's framework through what he called the transcendent function. Introduced in his 1916 essay of the same name, the transcendent function is the psyche's capacity to hold two opposite conditions simultaneously, the conscious position and the unconscious compensation, and to allow what Jung called a living third thing to emerge from that tension. When the ego's existing understanding of itself is held in tension with what the pain is revealing that it could not previously see, the transcendent function produces a new synthesis, a configuration of the self that is more inclusive, more adequate, and more genuinely the person's own than what preceded it. This synthesis is the transformation. What the transcendent function requires in order to operate is something that the ordinary mind finds profoundly counterintuitive. It requires that the tension between opposites be sustained rather than prematurely resolved. The most natural response to the pain of holding two irreconcilable conditions simultaneously is to collapse one of them, to force a conclusion, to choose one side, to declare the matter resolved before the psyche has finished its work. But premature resolution collapses the tension that was generating the new synthesis. In Jung's framework, the capacity to hold tension, to remain present with the genuine difficulty of a situation without forcing either a false resolution or an escape, is not simply a virtue. It is the specific interior condition under which the transformation can occur. The pain, in this understanding, is not in spite of the transformation. It is the creative condition for it. If this framework is giving language to something you have been living without being able to name, if it is making something visible that was already there, let me know by liking this video. That feedback tells me this kind of depth is what you are here for, and it keeps this work going. The transformation that significant pain initiates almost always involves what Jung's framework would describe as a humbling of the ego, a reduction in the ego's certainty about its own adequacy, its own understanding, its own capacity to manage whatever life produces. This humbling is experienced from the inside as precisely the kind of painful loss of ground that makes suffering most difficult to endure. What is being lost is the feeling of being in control, of knowing what one is doing, of having a self-concept adequate to the demands being made on it. But in the Jungian framework, this loss is not simply destructive, it is preparatory. The ego that has been humbled by what it could not manage has become, by that process, more permeable to what the deeper layers of the psyche have been attempting to contribute, more open to what could not have been integrated while the ego's certainty remained intact. Jung's concept of the self, distinguished from the ego by being the totality of the psyche rather than simply its conscious center, is essential to understanding who or what is directing the transformation that pain initiates. The self, in Jung's framework, is the organizing principle of the whole psyche, not the conscious intentions of the individual, but the deeper teleological movement of the entire psychological system toward its own fullest expression. When significant pain disrupts the ego's existing organization, it frequently does so in ways that, from the ego's perspective, appear random or arbitrary. From the perspective of the self's developmental logic, however, the disruption is precisely targeted. It is dismantling what needs to be dismantled to allow the next phase of the individuation to proceed. The pain in this understanding is not happening to you in spite of the self. The self is working through it. The specific psychological mechanism through which pain is converted into strength, the actual interior process, is what Jung called integration. Integration is not the same as healing in the ordinary sense of recovering from an injury and returning to the previous condition. It is the assimilation of what the painful experience revealed into the self's ongoing structure. What the pain showed about the limits of the previous ego organization, about the shadow material that was contributing to the difficulty, about the deeper needs and capacities that were being excluded, must be genuinely taken in rather than simply acknowledged and moved past. Integration takes time. It cannot be rushed without undermining itself. But when it proceeds fully, what is integrated becomes part of the self's actual substance, not a memory of what was endured, but a dimension of who the self has genuinely become. After the nigredo, the darkness, the dissolution, the breaking down of what was, the alchemical process moves into the albedo, the whitening, the clarification, the emergence of something that has been refined by the dissolution it underwent. In psychological terms, the albedo corresponds to the period in which what was revealed by the dark phase begins to be understood, when the clarity that was impossible during the most acute suffering starts to become available, and when the shape of what the pain was doing begins to be legible for the first time. This is not yet the final stage of the alchemical process. It is the stage in which the interior work shifts from endurance to understanding, from surviving the dissolution to beginning to see what the dissolution was producing. The albedo does not always arrive on any schedule the ego would prefer. The final stage of the alchemical process, the rubedo, the reddening, the production of the philosopher's stone, corresponds in Jung's psychological framework to what might be called the full incarnation of the transformed self. The point at which what was produced through the dark work of the nigredo and the clarifying work of the albedo becomes genuinely embodied in the person's actual way of living and relating and working in the world. This is not a mystical achievement. It is, in practical terms, the point at which the strength that was built through the pain endured is no longer something the person is aware of carrying, because it has become simply who they are. The philosopher's stone the alchemist sought was not a material substance. It was the self that has been fully transformed by its own most difficult interior work. One of the most consistent features of the transformation that significant pain initiates is the precision of its timing, the way it tends to arrive not when it is most convenient, but when it is most necessary. From the ego's perspective, the timing of serious suffering is almost always wrong. It arrives before the person feels equipped to handle it, at points in life when the existing structure is least able to absorb what it delivers. From the perspective of the self's developmental logic, however, the timing is exact. The pain arrives when the existing configuration has reached the limit of what it can produce, when the next development that the individuation requires cannot be initiated by anything less than the kind of disruption that serious suffering provides. This is not a comforting observation when the pain is still acute, but it is an accurate one. If you have been living in the space between recognizing what the pain was doing and actually being able to navigate the transformation it initiated, there may be a specific layer that needs direct attention. I left something for exactly that in the first pinned comment. It's for those who are ready to move from understanding to genuine navigation. The strength that emerges from genuinely endured and genuinely metabolized pain is recognizable by specific qualities, and it is worth naming those qualities precisely because the word strength is used so broadly that it can obscure what is actually being developed. The strength produced by significant suffering is not hardness. It is not the capacity to feel less. It is not the ability to endure more without being affected. It is, in the Jungian framework, something closer to psychological depth, the capacity to hold more of what human experience actually is, to remain present with complexity and difficulty without being destabilized, to encounter what is most challenging in others and in oneself without needing to immediately resolve or escape it. This is a qualitatively different kind of strength than the one that is built through the avoidance of difficulty. The depth that pain produces, when it is genuinely inhabited rather than resisted, is perhaps the most accurate description of what the Jungian transformation of suffering actually yields. Depth, in this framework, is not simply emotional sensitivity or intellectual complexity. It is the quality of having been genuinely present with the most difficult dimensions of one's own interior, of having encountered the shadow, the limitation, the grief, the failure, and having remained present through it rather than either collapsing or hardening. A person who has that quality of depth carries something into their relationships, their work, and their engagement with the world that cannot be faked or substituted. It is recognizable to others who have their own genuine depth, often without either party being able to articulate exactly what they are recognizing. It is simply present. The form of compassion that is produced specifically by endured suffering, rather than by simply wishing well for others from a position of comfort, is one of the most distinctive and most valuable of the gifts that Jung's wounded healer concept identifies. This compassion is not sentiment. It is not the feeling of warmth toward those who are suffering that can be generated without personal contact with difficulty. It is something structurally different. The capacity to be genuinely present with another person's pain because one's own interior has been organized by suffering to hold pain without being overwhelmed by it. The person who carries this compassion does not flinch from what is most difficult in others. They move toward it, not because they are performing empathy, but because their own most difficult interior work has made them genuinely at home in the territory. One of the most practically significant forms of strength that endured pain produces is what might be called authority without position, a quality of psychological weight and genuine presence that does not depend on external credentials, titles, or circumstances to be felt by others. This is distinct from confidence, which can be performed from a position of relative comfort. The authority that pain produces is grounded in something that cannot be appropriated. The actual experience of having been genuinely tested and genuinely changed. Others sense this quality because it is real. There is no mechanism for faking it, because it is produced by a process that cannot be bypassed. And it tends to be the kind of authority that others trust, not because they are supposed to, but because the person who carries it has been somewhere interior that their presence alone communicates. Significant psychological pain has a consistent and often underappreciated effect on the interior hierarchy of values, on what the person experiencing it recognizes as genuinely important, in contrast to what is simply urgent, familiar, or externally sanctioned. The experience of genuine suffering strips away the things that the ordinary life of comfort allowed the person to believe were essential. What is stripped away reveals, in its absence, what was actually load-bearing. The values that survive, that continue to feel genuinely important in the middle of genuine difficulty, are not the inherited values, not the socially approved values, not the values that were absorbed from the family system without critical examination. They are the actual values of the actual self. And the clarity of knowing what is actually important is itself among the most significant forms of interior strength. Something that serious pain consistently and reliably does to the psychological personality is interrupt the performance of the self that was being maintained before the pain arrived. Performance in this sense does not mean theater or deception. It refers to the ordinary maintenance of a self-presentation organized around what the social environment requires rather than around what the interior actually is. Significant suffering makes the performance too expensive. The energy required to maintain the gap between the presented self and the actual interior becomes unavailable, absorbed by what the suffering is demanding. And when the performance stops, what is revealed, the self that exists without the scaffolding of the constructed presentation, is frequently more genuine, more direct, and more genuinely comfortable to inhabit than the performance was. The end of the performance is frequently the beginning of the actual life. Among the most significant practical consequences of the transformation that pain produces is a shift in the kind of relationship the transformed person can enter and sustain. Before the transformation, relationships tend to be organized, at least in part, by the managed presentation of the self. by the implicit agreement that certain depths will not be shown, certain difficulties will not be brought, certain dimensions of what is real will remain unspoken in order to keep the relational surface smooth. After the transformation, that agreement becomes increasingly impossible to maintain, because the person who has been genuinely changed by suffering is no longer organized around keeping the surface smooth. They are organized around what is real. And they naturally seek and naturally attract relationships capable of holding what is real, which are almost always richer, more genuinely sustaining, and more genuinely alive than the relationships the managed presentation made possible. The suffering that reorganizes the interior has a specific and consistent effect on the person's relationship to their work and vocational direction. The vocation that becomes visible after significant pain, or that becomes possible only after it, tends to be organized around precisely the dimension of experience that the pain revealed. The person whose suffering involved genuine isolation develops the capacity to accompany others in their isolation. The person whose wound was the experience of being unseen develops the capacity to see others in ways that are uncommon. The person who survived something that most people find unsurvivable develops the authority to speak from exactly that territory. This is the wounded healer principle extended to vocation. The wound identifies the direction, not despite the difficulty it carried, but because of it. The transformation that pain initiates does not complete itself automatically. It requires conscious engagement with what the painful experience revealed, a willingness to turn toward what the suffering surfaced rather than, having survived the most acute phase, returning as quickly as possible to the previous mode of living. This turning toward is not dramatic. It does not require extraordinary resources or specialized knowledge. It requires primarily the honest willingness to examine what the pain made visible, the shadow material that became undeniable, the values that were clarified, the relationships that could not hold, the self-presentation that became too expensive to maintain. What is examined can be worked with, what is worked with can be integrated, and what is integrated becomes part of the self's actual substance, rather than a chapter the self is relieved to have closed. One of the most practically significant conditions for the transformation to proceed is one that the contemporary environment makes increasingly difficult to access: genuine interior quiet. The transformation that pain initiates takes place below the threshold of the ordinary busy mind, in the layers of the psyche that require stillness to become audible. In the absence of that stillness, the processing that needs to happen remains interrupted. The dream life that carries the psyche's ongoing work of integration cannot be attended to. The felt sense of what is shifting cannot be distinguished from the noise, and the insights that arise naturally in quiet tend to be crowded out before they can be examined. Deliberate solitude, not as withdrawal from life, but as protected interior space, is not a luxury in the context of genuine psychological transformation. It is a structural requirement of the process. Sustained reflective practice, whether through writing, structured contemplation, or any form of deliberate attention to the interior, performs a specific function in the transformation process that cannot easily be replaced by other means. It externalizes the interior in a way that makes it examinable. What is held only internally tends to circulate in the same patterns, organized by the same emotional charge, returning to the same conclusions. When it is externalized, written, spoken, drawn, it becomes visible in a new way. The patterns can be seen rather than simply repeated. The emotional charge can be related to rather than inhabited entirely. And the insights that arise from that new perspective are qualitatively different from the ones available to a mind that remains inside the material it is attempting to understand. The practice of reflection is, in this sense, a specific technology for making the transformation conscious. The relationships that support genuine psychological transformation are not the relationships that protect the person from what they are going through, offering reassurance that it is not as serious as it feels, providing distraction from the interior work, or simply affirming whatever the person wants to hear. They are the relationships that are capable of being genuinely present with what is actually happening. This is a relatively rare relational capacity, and it should not be confused with the far more common capacity for sympathy. Sympathy responds to another's pain by wishing it were different. The presence that supports transformation responds by remaining, by tolerating the uncertainty, by being genuinely interested in what the process is producing, by trusting that the person undergoing the difficulty is moving through something rather than simply suffering. The relationships that can do this become, themselves, part of the structure of the transformation. In Jung's framework, one of the most significant shifts available to someone in the midst of serious suffering is the shift from experiencing the pain as something purely happening to them, as an enemy, an intrusion, an interruption of the life they intended to be living, toward a quality of engagement with the process itself. This is not resignation. It is not the suppression of the genuine wish that the circumstances were different. It is something more specific, a willingness to remain curious about what the experience is producing rather than exclusively focused on when it will end. The question, "What is this developing in me?" does not diminish the pain, but it orients the psyche differently, toward the process rather than away from it, and that reorientation is frequently what makes the difference between suffering that simply passes and suffering that transforms. The body participates in the transformation of pain into strength in ways that Jung's framework acknowledges, but that contemporary culture frequently neglects to the process's significant detriment. The suffering that was endured was not simply a psychological event, it was a somatic one, held in the nervous system, in the patterns of tension and release, in the quality of inhabiting the physical self. As the transformation proceeds and the interior work advances, the body registers the shift. The chronic quality of tension that accompanied the acute period of suffering begins, gradually, to release. The quality of inhabiting the body changes, becoming less guarded, less braced for impact, more genuinely at ease in a way that is distinct from numbness. Attending to the body's participation in the process, rather than treating the body as simply the container in which the psychological transformation occurs, supports the integration in ways that purely mental engagement cannot. Time, in the context of genuine psychological transformation, does not simply pass, it works. What felt unbearable at its most acute becomes, over time, not simply less acute, but genuinely meaningful in ways that were impossible to access while the pain was most present. The distance that time provides is not simply the fading of intensity. It is the development of perspective, the growing capacity to see the shape of what the experience was, the direction it was moving in, the changes it was initiating that could not be perceived from inside the most difficult moments. This development of perspective is not the same as resolution. The loss that was genuinely significant does not become insignificant with time. But the relationship the self has with that loss shifts from being primarily defined by it to being informed by it. And that shift is among the most significant gifts that time contributes to the transformation. What becomes available as the transformation proceeds, the dimensions of the self that the pain was, in its way, working to make possible, does not arrive all at once or according to any schedule the ego would have preferred. It emerges gradually, in small increments at first, then with increasing clarity. The creative capacity that the previous self-organization did not have room for, the relational depth that was not yet possible before the suffering organized the interior for it. the vocational direction that was not yet visible before the pain stripped away, the alternatives that were not, in the end, genuinely the self's own. The intelligence that was developing, in the underground of the psyche, throughout the entire difficult period. All of this, not as a promised destination but as an ongoing emergence, becomes progressively available as the transformation does its work. One of the most significant and least anticipated consequences of genuinely endured and genuinely metabolized suffering is the shift in the person's relationship to difficulty itself. Before the transformation, difficulty tends to be experienced primarily as threat, as something to be avoided, minimized, or endured as briefly as possible before returning to more comfortable conditions. After the transformation, the relationship changes. Not because the person becomes masochistic, not because they no longer prefer ease to hardship, but because they have developed, through their own experience, the interior evidence that difficulty can produce something. They have been through enough to know that what is hard does not remain only hard. This knowledge, not as an abstract belief, but as an embodied understanding grounded in specific lived experience, changes how the subsequent difficulties of life are encountered. The contribution that a genuinely transformed person makes to the lives of others, to the people around them, to their work, to their communities, is not primarily the contribution of their ideas, or their productivity, or their social role. It is the contribution of their actual presence. A person whose interior has been organized by genuine suffering and genuine transformation brings something into every room they enter and every relationship they inhabit that cannot be produced by comfort, by education, or by effort alone. They bring the quality of someone who has been genuinely tested. The questions they ask come from that depth. The quality of attention they offer comes from that depth. The understanding they extend comes from it. This contribution cannot be manufactured. It can only be developed through exactly the kind of experience that the person who made it would almost certainly have preferred, in the midst of it, not to have. One of the least visible but most consistent effects of genuine personal transformation is what happens in the lives of those who are in close contact with the person who has been transformed. A person who has done the interior work, who has metabolized what the suffering produced, integrated the shadow it revealed, and emerged with a qualitatively deeper and more genuine sense of who they are, changes the relational field around them in ways that are difficult to trace, but real in their effects. Others in genuine relationship with that person find it easier to be more genuinely themselves. The permission that genuine authenticity gives is transmitted without words. The depth that has been developed in one person becomes, through contact, more available to others. This is not something the transformed person intends or manages. It is a natural consequence of what they have become. There is a particular quality to the understanding that becomes available when, from a sufficient distance, one looks back at the period of greatest suffering, a quality that is different from simple relief at having survived it, or from the intellectualized recognition that it produced growth. It is something more specific, the ability to see, from the vantage point of what was produced by the difficulty, what the difficulty was actually doing. To see not just that it hurt, but what it was making. To trace the specific connection between what was most painful and what is most genuinely one's own now. To recognize, in the shape of the transformation, the precise contours of the wound that produced it. This retrospective clarity is one of the gifts that only time and genuine interior work together can produce, and it changes permanently how the past is carried. One of the features of genuine psychological transformation that distinguishes it from the ordinary recovery from difficulty is its irreversibility. A person who has simply endured a painful period and survived it can, in principle, return to something very close to the previous condition, can reconstruct the patterns, reassume the self-presentation, re-enter the relational configurations that the suffering temporarily disrupted. A person who has been genuinely transformed by suffering cannot. The reorganization that has occurred is structural. The shadow material that was integrated cannot be unintegrated. The values that were clarified cannot be unclarified. The depth that was developed does not retreat. This irreversibility is not a trap. It is a form of permanence that the ordinary self rarely achieves. What was built through the pain cannot be taken away by any change in circumstances, because it is not located in the circumstances, it is located in the self. Jung was consistent in his understanding, one that runs against both the cultural valorization of comfort and the therapeutic ambition to eliminate suffering, that the most significant contributions individuals make to the broader collective arise not from their most comfortable periods, but from the interior work done during their most difficult ones. The person who has undergone genuine transformation through genuine suffering and brought what was revealed into conscious integration carries something into the collective that comfort cannot produce. In Jung's framework, the individuation of the individual is not in tension with contribution to the world. It is, precisely, the prerequisite for it. The strength that pain developed, the depth, the compassion, the authority, the clarity, finds its fullest expression, not in the private interior, but in how it shapes the person's engagement with everything and everyone around them. The dimensions of the self that the transformation makes available, the depth, the creative capacity, the quality of genuine presence, the specific gift of the wound, were not created by the suffering. They were present before it, developing in the interior in ways that the existing self-organization could not yet accommodate. The pain did not build them from nothing. It made space for what was already there. This distinction matters because it changes the relationship to the transformation. The self that emerges is not a stranger, not something entirely new, not a replacement for what was there before. It is a more complete expression of what was always there, but never had room. The recognition of this, of having become, through the most difficult interior work, more genuinely oneself rather than something else entirely, is among the most significant and most sustaining recognitions that the individuation process produces. What the transformation of pain into strength requires, across its full arc, from the initial endurance through the interior work to the integration and the emergence, is a specific form of courage that is different from the courage of physical endurance or social performance. It is the courage of remaining present with what is most difficult in the interior when every instinct inclines toward flight. The courage of continuing to examine what was revealed rather than closing the examination prematurely. The courage of inhabiting a self that is in the middle of being reorganized, not yet fully what it is becoming, no longer what it was, rather than retreating to the familiar shape simply because it is familiar. This interior courage is not dramatic. It makes no external show. But it is what the transformation in every significant case has required. The sense of home, the felt experience of being in the right place, in genuine alignment with one's own interior, undergoes a specific transformation through the process of pain becoming strength. Before the transformation, the sense of home tends to be located externally, in particular relationships, in familiar circumstances, in the approval of others, in the continuation of conditions that the existing self-organization was built to maintain. After the transformation, the sense of home shifts toward the interior, toward the quality of being genuinely present with oneself, genuinely aligned with what has become one's own actual nature and direction. This interior home is not permanent contentment. It is something more reliable than contentment, a quality of fundamental alignment between the self that is living the life and the self the life is genuinely capable of expressing. and it cannot be revoked by any change in the external landscape. The life that the transformation makes possible, that becomes available on the other side of the suffering's interior work, is not a better version of the life that was being lived before the pain arrived. It is something categorically different, a life that is organized around what the actual self actually requires, rather than around what the previous self-organization was constructed to produce. It carries the marks of what was endured. It does not pretend those marks are not there, but it is not defined by them. It is shaped by them, in the way that the work of the most skilled craftsperson is shaped by the specific qualities of the material they have worked with for years. The transformation does not erase the difficulty. It converts it into the specific substance from which only this particular life, this particular contribution, this particular quality of presence could have been made. The pain you endured was not a detour from the life you were meant to live. It was, in the precise framework that Jung developed across decades of clinical observation and theoretical work, the instrument through which the self you were always capable of becoming was being built, not despite the difficulty, not alongside it, but through it, in the specific and irreplaceable way that the alchemical nigredo precedes the gold, that the wound of the healer is inseparable from the healing they carry, that the transcendent function works most powerfully at the extreme edge of what the existing structure can hold. What you have carried has been doing something. What it has been building is becoming available, and the life that is now becoming possible is not a consolation for what was difficult. It is the most accurate expression of what was always, at the deepest level, actually yours. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, "My pain is becoming my greatest strength." That declaration is not small. It marks the moment the process becomes conscious, and what becomes conscious can be worked with. I've placed another lesson on your screen right now that continues exactly where this one ends. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.